This case began with a secret, one that Eric Mond believed would remain contained. Mond was a wealthy Texas auto dealer with access, money, and influence. At some point years before 2020, he entered into an extramarital relationship with Holly Williams, who lived in Nashville. The relationship ended, but the knowledge of it did not. That information stayed alive, waiting for the moment it could be used. By early 2020, Williams was dating William Lanway. According to federal prosecutors, Lanway learned about the past relationship between Williams and Mond and believed it gave him leverage. The secret shifted from personal history to a bargaining chip. Lanway allegedly threatened to expose the affair to Mond's wife unless Mond paid him. To Lanway, disclosure meant power. To Mond, disclosure meant loss of reputation, marriage, and control. At the same time, Holly Williams was navigating tension she did not fully understand. Her past had resurfaced in a way she did not direct. She continued living her life in Nashville, unaware that decisions were being made elsewhere that would soon determine her fate. Lanway pressed forward, believing pressure would force compliance. Mond, meanwhile, entered the same psychological stage as the others: urgency. All three believed action was necessary. All three believed they still had options. Instead of contacting law enforcement or pursuing legal protection from extortion, Mond looked for a private solution. He contacted Gilad Peled, someone he trusted to handle difficult matters discreetly. What began as a discussion about managing a threat quickly shifted in tone. According to court records, the conversation moved from stopping exposure to eliminating the source of it. The logic hardened. If the threat disappeared, the problem would disappear with it. Peld introduced Mond to individuals who claimed they could handle the situation permanently. Plans were discussed. Logistics were considered. Money was arranged. This was not a moment of panic. It was a progression. While Mond weighed costs and outcomes, Williams continued her routines, and Lanway continued to escalate. Three lives moving forward at the same pace, each reacting to pressure, none fully seeing the trajectory they were sharing. On March 12, 2020, the parallel paths collided. Williams and Lanway were approached in Nashville by men posing as law enforcement officers. The disguise worked. Both were shot and killed. The violence was swift, but it was not spontaneous. It was the endpoint of a plan already set in motion. That same day, Mond authorized a wire transfer of approximately $150,000, part of a payment trail that investigators later said exceeded $750,000. The timing aligned with the completion of the murders. The money moved after the threat was gone. In the immediate aftermath, the lives involved diverged sharply. The families of Williams and Lanway entered shock and grief. Mond returned to Texas believing the situation had been resolved. For a brief moment, the secret he feared exposure of seemed buried. But investigators were already beginning to see patterns. Financial records, encrypted communications, phone data, and travel logs began pointing outward from Nashville, connecting the crime to people far removed from the scene. The investigation widened. Intermediaries were identified. Arrests followed. Evidence accumulated quietly, piece by piece. In March 2022, Gilad Peled pleaded guilty, admitting his role as the middleman who helped connect Mond to the hired killers. His plea clarified the structure of the conspiracy but did not resolve Mond's legal fate. Mond chose not to plead guilty. He went to trial. In November 2023, a federal jury convicted Mond on murder for hire and related charges. At that moment, the case appeared settled. The verdict carried the weight of a mandatory life sentence. Public reporting reflected a sense of finality. It seemed the justice system had reached its conclusion, closing the arc that began with a threat tied to exposure. But the legal story did not end there. In September 2024, a federal judge vacated Mond's convictions and ordered a new trial. The ruling was based on a structural error in the trial process. During jury deliberations, materials that were not intended for juror review were mistakenly made available, creating what the court described as a structural error that compromised the fairness of the trial. Under federal law, such an error calls the fairness of the entire proceeding into question. The judge did not rule on Mond's guilt or innocence. The ruling addressed process, not outcome. That decision reset the case. The 2023 convictions no longer carried legal force. The mandatory life sentence was voided. However, the charges remained. The evidence remained. The case was not dismissed. In October 2024, federal prosecutors appealed the decision. They argued that while the error was serious, it did not justify overturning the jury's verdict. They asked for the convictions to be reinstated. The defense maintained that the integrity of the trial had been compromised and that a new trial was necessary. The dispute moved out of the trial court and into appellate review. As of when this video was uploaded, the case remains before the 6th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. Judges are weighing whether the new trial order should stand or whether the original convictions should be restored. Until that ruling is issued, the legal outcome remains unresolved. Mond remains in federal custody, held while the appeal proceeds. He has not been finally sentenced, and the path forward, retrial or reinstated verdict, has not yet been decided. Here, the system is stuck between reinstating the original conviction and going for a new trial. If you believe these stories should be told in honor of the memory of the victims, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate the support. Thank you. Moving on to the next case on the list. 2 prison systems, 2 continents, and sentences that overlap without ever truly meeting. A 28-year murder sentence and an additional 18 years for drug trafficking are being served in Peru. A separate 20-year federal sentence for wire fraud and extortion was imposed in the United States in 2023 and ordered to run concurrently. Because of that structure, the American punishment did not move the prisoner to a U.S. cell for decades. It briefly brought him into a federal courtroom, then sent him back to Peru, where he remains incarcerated as of early 2026. The legal connection between these places is not travel. It is repetition of silence, leverage, and control. That repetition stretches back to Aruba in May 2005. Natalie Holloway, an 18-year-old from Alabama, disappeared during a graduation trip. She was last seen leaving with a small group of local men. What followed was not resolution, but absence. No remains were recovered. No murder charges were filed. The investigation stalled, and time began to do what evidence could not. It allowed uncertainty to settle in and stay. From the very beginning, the case was shaped by what was missing. As months turned into years, that absence took on weight. For Holloway's family, unanswered questions became permanent. For the man last seen with her, the lack of legal closure created something else: space. Space to speak, to retract, to change stories, and eventually to stay quiet. Silence became protection long before it became leverage. In 2010, the pattern resurfaced in a different country. In Lima, Peru, Stephanie Flores was killed inside a hotel room. The man responsible later pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 28 years in prison. Years later, an additional 18-year sentence was added for drug trafficking committed while incarcerated. The conviction confirmed a capacity for violence that had long been suspected. Yet even this certainty did not resolve the Aruba disappearance. Instead, it deepened the imbalance. A proven killer remained central to an unresolved case. Silence still held. While imprisoned in Peru, that silence changed form. According to U.S. court records, communication began through intermediaries with people connected to the Holloway family. The message followed a familiar shape: claims of knowledge, promises of answers, and conditions attached. He said he knew what happened in Aruba. He said he could reveal where Natalie Holloway's remains were located. The price for that information was money. Federal prosecutors later said the demands reached into the tens of thousands of dollars. The proposal framed truth as a transaction and grief as leverage. In 2010, money was wired as part of what the family believed would finally lead to answers. What they received instead were false statements. The location provided led nowhere. The silence returned. now reinforced by deception. At this stage, the harm was no longer limited to the original disappearance. It had expanded. Prosecutors would later describe the conduct as wire fraud and extortion, emphasizing that the crime was not simply taking money, but knowingly selling lies to people acting under emotional strain. The unresolved case was no longer just an absence of justice. It had become a tool. For more than a decade, the pattern held. The prisoner remained in Peru. The Holloway case remained legally untouched. The extortion allegations existed without consequence. Silence continued to function as insulation. That balance shifted in 2023. The United States secured a temporary extradition to face federal charges in Alabama. The case did not reopen the Holloway murder investigation. It targeted the financial crime built on years of uncertainty. For the first time, silence itself became the liability. Once in U.S. custody, the evidence was direct. Financial records traced the wire transfers. Communications showed the promises made and the false information delivered. Facing sentencing exposure that would follow him regardless of where he was imprisoned, plea negotiations began. It was during this process that the longest withheld truth surfaced. As part of those negotiations, a proffer letter was submitted to federal authorities. In American law, a proffer is a statement offered during discussions, often in hopes of consideration at sentencing. In that letter, Joran Vandersloot admitted that he killed Natalie Holloway in 2005. He described an argument on an Aruban beach that escalated into lethal violence and said her body was disposed of in the ocean. The context of the admission mattered. It was not delivered during a murder trial. It was not supported by new physical evidence. Prosecutors made clear that the confession emerged under pressure created by the extortion case, not from a reopened homicide investigation. Truth surfaced because silence had finally lost its value. In October 2023, he pleaded guilty to wire fraud and extortion. The court imposed a 20-year federal sentence, ordered to run concurrently with his Peruvian terms, and required restitution to the Holloway family. Shortly after sentencing, he was returned to Peru, where he continues to serve his combined sentences as of early 2026. The confession raised another unresolved issue. Aruban authorities and legal experts noted that Aruba's 12-year statute of limitations for murder had likely expired by the time of the 2023 admission. Despite the confession, a new prosecution there was considered legally difficult. The truth surfaced, but the law could not fully act on it. Truth hidden, hope raised, let's see what lies in store in the third case. The effect of death on her athletic career was immediate, total, and irreversible. Lauren McCluskey was a nationally ranked track and field athlete whose training cycles, competition plans, and long-term goals ended the moment her life was taken on October 22, 2018. There was no final season to complete, no closing meet, no chance to step away from sport on her own terms. Years of disciplined preparation, conditioning, recovery, and constant repetition stopped at once. For an athlete whose progress depended on continuity, death erased the future value of everything she had already built. Before that night, Lauren's athletic identity was lived daily. She was 21 years old, a senior at the University of Utah, and a core member of the school's track and field program. Her schedule followed a strict rhythm: practice blocks, strength sessions, classes arranged around training, rest planned for recovery. Track and field rewards, patience and consistency. Improvements come through thousands of controlled efforts stacked over time. Lauren's career was moving forward through that process, assuming the next season would arrive. That assumption began to weaken during the fall of 2018. Lauren briefly dated Melvin Rowland, a man who misrepresented his age and background. When she discovered the truth and ended the relationship, his behavior changed. Contact continued after she asked him to stop. Messages persisted. His presence felt intrusive. These pressures did not immediately remove her from training or competition, but they began to intrude into daily life in ways athletes understand well. Disrupted focus, mental fatigue layered on top of physical demand, and constant alertness that interferes with recovery. Lauren responded with the same discipline she applied to sport. She documented what was happening and sought help. Over the weeks that followed, she contacted campus police repeatedly. Independent investigations later confirmed she reached out more than 20 times in the weeks leading up to her death. These were not duplicate calls about a single event. They included reports of stalking, harassment, and fear for her safety. Each contact added detail. Together, they formed a clear pattern of escalation. One of the most serious reports occurred on October 12, 2018. Lauren told campus police that Rowland demanded $1,000 and threatened to release private photos if she refused. This was extortion, clearly identified as such. By this point, Lauren had already uncovered Rowland's real name and age, 37, and provided that information directly to officers. This matters because it corrects a common misunderstanding. The suspect was identified. His identity was known. Despite this, officers did not respond with urgency. Rowland was on parole and had a criminal history, including being a registered sex offender. That status was not acted on in a way that matched the risk. No arrest followed. No coordinated protective measures were implemented. No comprehensive threat assessment connected Lauren's repeated reports into a single evaluation of danger. Lauren continued to live on campus, attend classes, and train while waiting for protection that did not arrive. On the day of her murder, Lauren made another critical report. She told campus police that someone was attempting to lure her outside while pretending to be a police officer. This detail is essential to understanding the immediacy of the danger. That report, according to investigative findings, was not effectively acted upon before the shooting occurred later that night. It was one more warning added to an already long record of concern, and it arrived when time mattered most. On the night of October 22, 2018, Lauren McCluskey was shot and killed in the parking lot of her on-campus student housing complex. Investigators confirmed that Melvin Rowland was the shooter. The timeline is precise and documented. Weeks of repeated reports, more than 20 contacts with campus police, a confirmed extortion threat on October 12th, a same-day report of someone impersonating an officer. Hours later, Lauren's life and her athletic career ended. The following day, October 23, 2018, Rowland was found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound after a multi-agency search. His death closed the criminal case but opened a wider examination of institutional responsibility. Independent reviews later confirmed that the university's response was a contributing factor in Lauren's death. Those reviews went further. In 2020, as part of a civil settlement, the University of Utah explicitly acknowledged that Lauren McCluskey's murder was a preventable tragedy. That language matters. It was not framed as an unavoidable outcome or an unforeseeable act. It was acknowledged as something that could have been stopped with appropriate response. The same settlement resulted in a $13.5 million agreement with the McCluskey family. The resolution was not only financial. Funds supported the creation and work of the Lauren McCluskey Foundation, focused on improving campus safety and violence prevention nationwide. The settlement marked a rare moment of institutional admission tied directly to documented failures. Investigations also examined officer conduct in Lauren's case. An independent report found that former campus police officer Miguel Duras showed the explicit photos connected to Lauren's extortion report to at least one other officer during a shift briefing and made unprofessional remarks. That conduct violated professional standards and reflected a serious lapse in judgment and respect for evidence and for the victim. Investigators also clarified limits to the finding. While the photos were improperly shown, there was no physical evidence that they were downloaded to a personal device or electronically transferred beyond the assigned detective. The confirmed misconduct lay in unprofessional display and commentary, not proven personal storage. If you found this video interesting so far, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to smash the like and subscribe buttons. Thanks for the support. Let's move on to the fourth case, October 20th, 1989. The date marks the day Kevin Ramsey was killed, but it does not explain why the killing felt unavoidable to the people involved. By the time that morning arrived, fear, leverage, and calculation had already compressed every perceived option. What happened at a remote shooting range that day was not a sudden eruption of violence. It was the endpoint of a psychological and strategic process that had been unfolding quietly for months. Konstantinos Fotopoulos was living with a constant vulnerability. He was involved in counterfeiting and fraud, criminal activity that could survive only through silence. Exposure meant prison. That reality shaped how he viewed everyone around him. Secrecy was not a preference. It was survival. Kevin Ramsey was not a stranger who stumbled onto damaging information. Testimony indicated that Ramsey had worked for Fotopoulos at his pool hall, Top Shots. That detail added a layer of personal betrayal to what followed. Ramsey was someone from inside Fotopoulos' orbit, someone who understood his business and his habits. When Ramsey learned about the counterfeiting operation, the threat felt closer and more dangerous than if it had come from an outsider. Ramsey did not report what he knew to authorities. Instead, he attempted to blackmail Fotopoulos. Court records show that he demanded money and cooperation, making it clear that refusal would lead to exposure. To Ramsey, knowledge became leverage. He believed the threat itself would keep him safe. To Fotopoulos, the blackmail felt like a tightening vice. Blackmail did not present itself as a single confrontation. It arrived as ongoing pressure. Each demand reinforced the same message: your freedom depends on my silence. Prosecutors later emphasized that this kind of pressure does not usually produce a single explosive decision. It produces compression. Options shrink. Time feels shorter. Judgment narrows. What distinguishes this case is how Fotopoulos responded to that pressure. He did not frame the solution simply as eliminating a blackmailer. He framed it as participation in a system designed to guarantee silence. Fotopoulos later claimed that Ramsey's murder was part of a supposed hunter-killer club, a fictional organization in which members recorded each other committing murders so that no one could report another without incriminating themselves. The court noted that this idea served a strategic criminal purpose as well as a psychological one. The tapes were not about ritual alone. They were meant to function as insurance. Mutual guilt would enforce mutual silence. Speaking would become self-destruction. This belief system became central to how Fotopoulos manipulated others. Deidre Hunt, his mistress, was drawn into the plan through a mix of emotional influence and pressure. Evidence showed that Fotopoulos used the club narrative to normalize violence and present participation as unavoidable. At the same time, the state later argued that Hunt was not entirely passive. While her defense successfully established that she was manipulated and coerced, prosecutors presented evidence suggesting she was also an active participant who may have believed she would benefit financially, including possibly sharing in the inheritance of Fotopoulos' wife if later plans succeeded. This tension between coercion and agency followed Hunt throughout her legal path. The meeting with Ramsey was arranged under pretenses. He was told he was being invited to a firearms-related outing. The location chosen was an isolated shooting range. The choice was practical, not symbolic. Gunfire would not draw attention. Distance would limit witnesses. The environment itself helped hide intent. On October 20th, 1989, Fotopoulos, Hunt, and Ramsey traveled together to the range. Emotionally, this is where the story inverts. Ramsey arrived believing he still held leverage. He believed the threat of exposure protected him. He did not recognize that the decision to kill had already been made and justified within Fotopoulos' constructed logic. Once at the site, Ramsey was restrained and tied to a tree. The power he believed he held vanished instantly. Hunt fired first, using a handgun. Her shots wounded Ramsey but did not kill him. Testimony later established that she was acting under Fotopoulos' direction. Afterward, Fotopoulos fired a final shot with a rifle, ending Ramsey's life. The killing was recorded on videotape. This detail is central to understanding the case. The recording was not an impulsive decision. It was part of the strategy. The tape served as proof of participation and as leverage. The court later noted that the recording was intended to ensure that no one involved could safely report the crime. For a brief period, Fotopoulos believed the threat had been erased. The blackmailer was gone. The leverage, he thought, no longer existed, but the fear that drove the murder did not disappear. It expanded. After Ramsey's death, Fotopoulos turned the same logic inward toward his own household. He became convinced that his wife Lisa was another obstacle. Rather than confront her directly, he staged what appeared to be a burglary at their home, intending to kill her and make the death look accidental. Law enforcement did not initially discover the videotape while investigating Ramsey's disappearance. They found it during the investigation into the staged burglary meant to kill Lisa. That investigation raised suspicions, led to searches, and ultimately revealed the tape. When investigators recovered the recording, the case changed instantly. What had been hidden, fear, became undeniable evidence. The tape captured the murder and included Fotopoulos's voice. It demonstrated planning, leadership, and intent with no room for reinterpretation. The tape also revealed how Fotopoulos used it as leverage against Hunt. Court records showed he threatened her with exposure if she did not continue cooperating, including helping arrange the later attempt on his wife's life. Participation did not end with Ramsey's murder. It deepened under threat. At trial, prosecutors framed the case as a calculated response to blackmail, amplified by manipulation and control. The fictional club was presented not as delusion, but as strategy. It was a way to bind others into silence through mutual guilt. Hunt's legal path reflected the complexity of her role. She initially pleaded guilty and was sentenced to death in 1990. Years later, she withdrew her plea. Following a 1998 retrial, she was resentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. The court acknowledged both her participation and the coercion she faced. Fotopoulos was convicted and sentenced to death. Decades later, he remains on death row at Union Correctional Institution. He has pursued multiple appeals over the years, including a 2018 challenge related to Florida's former practice of allowing non-unanimous jury recommendations for death sentences. The Florida Supreme Court reviewed and rejected those claims, leaving his death sentences intact. Hunt, now in her mid-50s, remains incarcerated at Homestead Correctional Institution. Since her resentencing, she has reportedly worked as a law clerk and led yoga sessions for other inmates, a structured and quiet existence far removed from the fear and manipulation that defined her role in the crimes. Lisa Fotopoulos, the survivor of the secondary plot, lived through an attempt on her life that ultimately exposed the earlier murder. After the trials concluded, she remarried and moved forward, distancing herself from the violence and control that once surrounded her. The transaction was meant to resolve leverage, but it produced irreversible harm. Case number 5 comes up next. £20,000 had already been paid. That fact sits at the center of everything that followed. It explains the fear, the pressure, and the fatal choice that came next. The governing idea in this case is simple and consistent. Money used as leverage does not end coercion. It deepens it. Every event that followed became evidence of that single psychological mechanism. Mohammed Arshad was 38 years old in December 2004, working as a taxi driver in Newport, South Wales. He was married and the father of 1 child. For years, he had been paying to keep a secret hidden. By the time the final demand arrived, another £4,000, he had already handed over roughly £20,000. Each payment was made with the same hope, that it would be the last. Each one proved the opposite. The woman demanding the money was Musarat Nazir, 37 years old. Court findings established that Arshad and Nazir had known each other as children. When they were young, Arshad exposed himself to her. The incident was never reported to police at the time. It remained unresolved and unaddressed, carried silently into adulthood. Decades later, that childhood act became leverage. As adults, Nazir contacted Arshad and threatened to tell his wife and family about what had happened unless he paid her. The blackmail was not brief or symbolic, it was sustained. Over time, Arshad paid large sums of money in an effort to keep the matter private. Prosecutors later told the court that Nazir was a heroin addict, and they suggested that her addiction helped explain why the demands were persistent and escalating. Every payment reinforced the same lesson. Silence could be purchased but never secured. Once money entered the exchange, refusal stopped feeling neutral. It began to feel dangerous. Arshad's fear was not framed in court as fear of arrest or prosecution. The defense emphasized that his dominant fear was dishonor, the belief that exposure would destroy his marriage, shame his family, and permanently damage his child's future. In his mind, truth did not represent relief. It represented collapse. By late 2004, the dynamic had hardened. The payments had not slowed the demands. They had normalized them. When Nazir asked for an additional £4,000, the demand did not feel like a new problem. It felt like confirmation that there would never be an endpoint. Prosecutors said Arshad believed the pressure would continue indefinitely. The fatal chain of events began not with planning, but with coincidence. In December 2004, Nazir happened to flag down Arshad's taxi in Newport. The meeting was not arranged. Neither expected to see the other. But chance encounters are not neutral when one person already holds leverage over the other. Inside the taxi, according to court reports, Nazir renewed her demand for money and again threatened exposure. That moment mattered because it collapsed the future into the present. The renewed demand made clear that paying again would only invite the next demand. Refusing felt, in Arshad's mind, like immediate ruin. This is the psychological compression that blackmail creates. Options exist in reality, but they shrink in perception. What followed was not spontaneous panic. It was a decision shaped by years of fear. After the demand was made, Arshad did not simply drop Nazir off and drive away. According to multiple court reports, he lured her to a remote area under the pretense of continuing the conversation and resolving the situation. The location was quiet and away from public view. It was chosen after the renewed demand, not before. Control over space followed control over money. At that location, Arshad strangled Nazir using a tow rope from his vehicle. Medical evidence presented later confirmed that strangulation was the cause of death and that it required sustained force. The act was deliberate. Nazir had no opportunity to escape. No one witnessed the killing itself. What happened next followed the same internal logic. Arshad attempted to erase the final link in the chain by setting Nazir's car on fire. Prosecutors described this as an effort to destroy evidence and delay identification. The attempt failed almost immediately. While no one saw the act of murder, 2 community safety officers saw Arshad fleeing from the burning vehicle. Their observation led directly to his arrest. There was no extended escape and no gap between the discovery and police action. Police reconstructed Nazir's final movements using witness statements, taxi records, and forensic evidence. The financial history between the two soon became clear. The payments, the renewed demand, and the final encounter formed a coherent sequence. When the case reached Cardiff Crown Court, Arshad initially denied murder. The trial began with a not guilty plea. The prosecution laid out the financial trail, the chance encounter, the renewed demand for money, the remote location, and the attempt to destroy evidence. As part of the proceedings, the jury was taken to visit the crime scene. It was after that visit, after the physical reality of the location and sequence became undeniable, that the case shifted. During the trial, Arshad changed his plea to guilty. The admission ended the need for a jury verdict, but it did not change the facts. The focus moved entirely to motive and sentencing. The prosecution acknowledged that Nazir had engaged in prolonged blackmail and that her addiction explained the persistence of her demands. They emphasized, however, that blackmail, regardless of scale, does not remove responsibility for murder. Arshad had lawful alternatives: refusing further payments, reporting the blackmail, or seeking legal help. The court noted that these options existed even if they did not feel viable to him at the time. The defense argued that the case was exceptional. They emphasized the length of the blackmail, the extraordinary amount of money already paid, and Arshad's fear of bringing dishonor to his family as a husband and father. The judge accepted that the pressure was unusually severe and sustained. That context mattered when determining the minimum term, though it did not excuse the killing. In July 2005, Arshad was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 10 years before he could apply for parole. In sentencing remarks reported widely, the judge described the case as exceptional because of the extreme blackmail involved. At the same time, the court made clear that the responsibility for taking a life rested solely with Arshad. Pressure explained the path. It did not justify the outcome. Case 5 ends here with the legal outcome, but the sixth case set in motion. Yuan Baojing entered China's private business world at a moment when speed mattered more than caution. Wealth moved fast. Deals were aggressive. Disputes were often settled quietly, without courts or paperwork. Within that environment, Yuan learned to believe that problems could be managed if enough pressure was applied. Control, to him, was not a concept, it was a habit. By the early 2000s, one business rivalry began to feel dangerous. The disagreement was no longer about profits alone. It carried personal risk, exposure, public conflict, or legal attention could undo everything Yuan had built. Instead of stepping back, he moved closer. He decided that removing the rival entirely would restore balance. That decision marked the true beginning of the story. Yuan hired Wang Xing, a former police officer who had left the force and was willing to break the law for money. Wang was chosen because he understood surveillance, enforcement, and silence. The plan was direct. A killing would end the threat. Control would be restored. The attempt failed. The intended victim survived. No arrest followed. No public alarm was raised. On the surface, it looked as though Yuan had avoided consequences. In reality, control had already slipped away. What remained was knowledge in the hands of someone who now understood its value. After the failed attempt, Wang Xing did not disappear. He returned. He understood exactly what he possessed. He knew who ordered the killing. He knew the motive, and he knew that this information could destroy Yuan Baojing if it became public. Wang began to demand money in exchange for silence. This was not a loud confrontation. It was quiet pressure, applied steadily. Each request reminded Yuan that another person's restraint now shaped his life. Paying once did not solve the problem. It confirmed the leverage. Time stopped feeling open. The space for decision-making narrowed. This is how blackmail compresses a situation. It removes long-term thinking and replaces it with urgency. Yuan's options reduced to two outcomes: continue paying indefinitely or eliminate the source of the pressure. For a man used to control, dependence felt unbearable. Yuan believed wealth had always provided exits, but blackmail closes doors instead of opening them. Every delay increased the risk that Wang would talk. Every interaction deepened the connection between them. Fear began to govern the situation. Not fear of violence, but fear of exposure, prison, public disgrace, the collapse of a carefully built identity. Yuan saw silence as the only form of safety left, and silence once again seemed purchasable. In October 2003, Yuan crossed a line from which there was no retreat. He arranged for Wang Xing to be killed. This was not an impulsive act. It was calculated, shaped by weeks of pressure and narrowing options. The killing did not take place in Beijing, as some early reports suggested. Court findings placed the murder in Liaoyang, Liaoning province, where Wang was shot to death. With Wang gone, the blackmail ended instantly. The immediate threat vanished. But this was the moment when the story tipped beyond recovery. A second killing changed everything. Investigators treated Wang's death differently. He was not a public figure, But his background, movements, and financial links drew attention. Phone records showed repeated contact with Yuan. Money trails revealed transfers that could not be explained as business transactions. Witness statements established motive. Wang had knowledge worth selling. Yuan had reason to silence him. The case formed around documentation, not confession. It showed how one crime created the conditions for the next. Yuan Baojing was arrested and charged with organizing both the failed contract killing and the murder of Wang Xing. Prosecutors presented the case as a chain of deliberate choices. The court accepted that argument. Yuan was convicted of intentional homicide and sentenced to death. This verdict represented another threshold. A man who believed control could always be restored through action now faced a system that did not negotiate in the same way. His wealth no longer shaped outcomes. Yuan's execution was initially scheduled for October 2005. As the date approached, the case took an unexpected turn. At the last moment, his wife transferred assets estimated at 49.5 billion yuan, including Indonesian oilfield shares, to the state. The execution was stayed. This delay did not erase guilt or alter the conviction. It demonstrated how assets could still influence timing, even when outcomes were fixed. Yuan remained on death row. The pause created uncertainty, not freedom. In 2006, the sentence was carried out. Yuan Baojing was executed by lethal injection in a mobile execution van, a method used in China at the time to carry out capital punishment efficiently and away from public view. The process was controlled, final. His wealth, influence, and connections had no place at the end. Years later, the story gained new attention. Investigations into powerful figures such as Bo Xilai and Zhou Yongkang reshaped how past cases were viewed. Within that context, analysts revisited Yuan's rivalry. Some speculated that his business rival, Liu Han, may have benefited from political protection during the period of Yuan's prosecution. 2 lives were lost. One ended by violence, the other by the state. The 7th case introduces a different dimension, March 25, 2022. That date anchors the case of Jordan DeMay, a 17-year-old high school student from Marquette, Michigan, and it marks how quickly online blackmail can compress choices into hours. On that Friday, Jordan entered what appeared to be a routine social media exchange with someone presenting as a peer. The tone was friendly at first. Within a short span, it was not. Investigators later confirmed the exchange became an online blackmail attempt. After a private image was obtained, demands followed. The amount escalated to $1,000, and records show Jordan paid $300 in an effort to stop the threats. The payment did not end the pressure. Instead, messages intensified, warning that the image would be shared with friends and family if more money was not sent. The language used was urgent and coercive, designed to eliminate pauses and keep the victim reacting. Court filings document just how fast this unfolded. The entire interaction lasted less than 6 hours. That speed was not accidental. Sextortion schemes rely on urgency to prevent reflection or outreach. During this window, when Jordan expressed despair, the responses from the extortionists were dismissive and hostile, escalating fear rather than stopping it. The record captures the cruelty of that moment without ambiguity. The replies pushed pressure forward, not away. Jordan died by suicide the same day. The investigation that followed traced the accounts behind the threats to Nigeria. Federal authorities identified brothers Samuel Ogoshi and Samson Ogoshi as central figures. As agents widened the scope, the case revealed a broad sextortion network. By 2024 to 2025, prosecutors documented more than 100 victims worldwide, including at least 11 minors, targeted through similar tactics: fake profiles, brief rapport, rapid demands, and scripted threats, emphasizing immediacy. In November 2022, a federal grand jury in the Western District of Michigan indicted the brothers on charges tied to the sexual exploitation of minors and extortion. Nigerian authorities arrested them, and in August 2023, both were extradited to the United States. The proceedings in 2024 detailed a repeatable method built for speed and scale rather than prolonged manipulation. In April 2024, both pleaded guilty. At sentencing in September 2024, a federal judge imposed 210-month prison terms on each, followed by supervised release, citing the scope of the operation and the harm caused, including Jordan's death. The case did not stop with those convictions. A third Nigerian defendant, Ezekiel Robert, was charged as part of the same ring. While earlier filings noted challenges through 2024, as of late 2025, he remained in Nigeria, continuing to pursue appeals against an extradition order. Investigators also identified U.S.-based support roles. In early 2025, federal prosecutors secured convictions against 5 money launderers based in Alabama and Georgia. These defendants did not contact victims directly. Instead, they handled proceeds, keeping roughly a 20% cut and converting the remainder to Bitcoin before transferring funds to the Nigerian group. Their convictions clarified how online extortion relies on layered logistics, communication, pressure, and finance, often spread across countries. Boundaries didn't stop blackmailing. Let's proceed to case number 8. The investigation began long after the damage was already done, with police in Northern Ireland trying to trace an online crime that had crossed borders, languages, and legal systems. Detectives from the Police Service of Northern Ireland were confronted with a case where the harm had originated through a screen, traveled through servers in multiple countries, and ended in the death of a teenager. From the start, they knew this would not be a local inquiry. It required international cooperation, technical expertise, and patience. Digital evidence had to be preserved, accounts traced, and online identities dismantled piece by piece. Working alongside Europol and Romanian authorities, investigators followed data trails that led far beyond County Tyrone toward a suspect operating from Eastern Europe. Their task was clear but difficult: identify the person responsible for an act of online blackmail that had already taken a life. As the investigation progressed, police were careful to reconstruct the sequence of events without assumptions. They examined chat logs, payment demands, and the timing of messages. What emerged was a pattern consistent with online blackmailing. The offender posed as someone else, gained trust quickly, and turned private material into leverage. According to court findings later reported by BBC News, the offender acted with speed, applying pressure before the victim had time to think or seek help. This method was not random. It relied on urgency, fear, and isolation. Each message was designed to reduce resistance. At the center of the case was Ronan Hughes, a 17-year-old from County Tyrone. Ronan was not known to police. He was not involved in criminal activity. He was a schoolboy navigating everyday teenage life. In June 2015, he was contacted online by someone he believed to be a young woman. The interaction appeared harmless at first. Conversations led to the sharing of intimate images. Almost immediately, the tone changed. Ronan was told those images would be shared unless money was paid. The demand was direct. The threat was clear. This first stage of blackmail created fear, but it also created a belief that the situation might still be controlled. The demand suggested a transaction: pay, and the images would remain private. Investigators later stated that Ronan tried to manage the situation alone. He did not involve adults or police. This is a common feature in cases involving young victims. Shame and fear often silence them at the moment when outside help would matter most. When Ronan could not meet the demand, the pressure escalated rapidly. Images were sent to people he knew. Friends received messages containing material Ronan had believed was private. This moment marked a turning point. The threat moved from possibility to reality. According to reporting by The Guardian, the images were shared within hours. There was no pause, no opportunity for the situation to slow down. Control shifted entirely to the offender. Ronan's sense of options narrowed sharply. the speed of escalation is critical to understanding what followed. This was not a prolonged campaign stretched over weeks or months. Events unfolded within a single day. Once the images were shared, the fear changed shape. It was no longer about what might happen, but about what was already happening. For a teenager, social exposure can feel permanent. The idea that the images could spread further, beyond friends, beyond school, may have felt impossible to contain. That compression of time and pressure removed the space needed to seek reassurance or help. Ronan died later that same day. His death was ruled a suicide. Investigators were committed to finding the person responsible, even though the crime scene existed largely in digital form. Tracing the offender required international cooperation. Data linked the blackmail messages to Romania. With assistance from Europol, Romanian police identified Iulian Enache as the individual responsible. The process involved forensic analysis of online accounts, financial requests, and communication platforms. It was slow work. Every request for information had to move through formal legal channels. Despite these obstacles, the investigation held. In August 2017, Enache appeared before a Romanian court. He admitted offenses related to blackmail and the distribution of indecent images. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Under Romanian law, time already served meant he would serve approximately 3 years. Both BBC News and The Guardian reported on the outcome, noting that while the conviction established responsibility, it could not undo the harm caused. The court acknowledged that the actions had contributed directly to Ronan's death. During sentencing, authorities emphasized the seriousness of online blackmail. They described it as a crime that weaponizes fear and speed. The offender does not need physical proximity to cause harm. A single device and an internet connection are enough. Police stressed that early reporting is essential. Once threats are made, paying does not guarantee safety. In many cases, it leads to further demands. Now, we advance to the 9th case. Glasgow, Kentucky, became the setting of a case in early 2025 that drew national attention not because of public violence, but because of how quietly harm unfolded behind a screen. What happened there did not involve a crowded scene or a visible confrontation. It unfolded through private messages, growing fear, and a form of blackmail that relied on silence to work. Understanding this case requires starting with where it happened, then carefully tracing how pressure accumulated before anyone outside the situation realized what was taking place. Glasgow is a small community where daily life tends to move at a familiar pace. Schools, family routines, and social circles often overlap. In that environment lived Elijah Heacock, a 16-year-old high school student. By all publicly reported accounts, he was not known to be in trouble, nor was he on the radar of law enforcement or school officials for concerning behavior. His life, like many teenagers, existed partly offline and partly online. It was in that online space where the threat emerged. According to reporting from national and local news outlets, Elijah became the target of what investigators later described as a sextortion scheme, a form of blackmail that has become increasingly common in recent years. Sextortion relies on the threat of exposure. The perpetrator claims to possess sexual or compromising images and uses that claim to demand money, silence, or continued compliance. In Elijah's case, authorities believe the images used as leverage were AI-generated, designed to appear realistic even if they were not authentic. The first contact did not involve physical danger. It involved a message. That detail is important because blackmail often begins without anything that looks immediately threatening from the outside. A claim is made. Proof may be shown or implied. Then comes the warning. These images could be shared. Friends, family, school contacts, social media. Each possible audience is left unstated but understood. For a teenager, the fear attached to that possibility can feel overwhelming and permanent. As the messages continued, the demands reportedly escalated. Investigators later found communications on Elijah's phone indicating requests for money, with figures reported in the thousands of dollars. The exact amount matters less than the structure of the demand. Payment was presented as the only way to stop the exposure. Delay was framed as risk. Silence was treated as defiance. Each message reduced the sense that there was a safe option. This is where the internal logic of escalation becomes critical. Blackmail functions by isolating the target. The victim is led to believe that asking for help will only make things worse. Parents might be disappointed, authorities might not help, friends might judge. The blackmailer does not need to say these things directly. The fear fills in the gaps. Over time, the victim begins to carry the burden alone. Family members later told reporters that they were unaware Elijah was being targeted while it was happening. That lack of awareness is not unusual in sextortion cases, especially involving minors. Teenagers often believe they must handle the situation themselves to avoid embarrassment or punishment. That belief, while understandable, gives blackmailers exactly what they need: time and control. On February 28, 2025, Elijah Heacock died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, according to official reporting. Law enforcement did not classify the death as a homicide. Instead, investigators focused on the role of the sextortion scheme in the events leading up to it. The FBI became involved due to the nature of the alleged online extortion and the possibility that the perpetrators were operating across state or national boundaries. Only after his death did investigators and family members discover the full extent of the messages and threats. His parents later spoke publicly about finding the communications on his phone and trying to understand how quickly the situation escalated. Their statements, reported by outlets such as People and ABC News, emphasized how trapped their son may have felt and how difficult it would have been for a teenager to see a way out once the threats began. The outcome did not occur in isolation. It was the final point in a sequence of pressure, fear, and isolation. Without understanding that sequence, the tragedy risks being misunderstood or oversimplified. Authorities emphasize that sextortion schemes often rely on anonymity and speed. The individuals behind the threats may never intend to follow through on exposure. In many cases, the images are fake and the threats are automated or part of larger criminal operations. But the victim does not know that. The fear feels real, immediate, and personal. Following Elijah Heacock's death, his case was cited in broader discussions about online safety, AI misuse, and the need for early reporting. Law enforcement agencies and child advocacy organizations reiterated guidance for young people. If someone threatens you online, stop responding, save the messages, and tell a trusted adult immediately. The power of blackmail collapses once secrecy is broken. Legislators and advocacy groups also pointed to the case while discussing stronger penalties for sextortion, faster reporting tools on social media platforms, and better education for parents and students about recognizing warning signs. The focus was not on punishment alone, but on prevention and awareness. Moving up to case number 10. In 2018, Dutch authorities agreed to extradite Aiden Coban to Canada, where prosecutors had spent years assembling a case rooted in digital records and victim testimony. The decision mattered because it challenged a common assumption about online crime, that distance protects offenders. In this case, it did not. The harm had occurred in Canada, and Canadian courts were prepared to hear it. When Coban entered the Canadian legal system, the focus was narrow and factual. Prosecutors did not present the case as symbolic or emotional. They presented it as a sustained pattern of conduct, online contact, deception, image capture, and repeated threats designed to maintain control. Among the victims identified through this pattern was Amanda Todd, a teenager from British Columbia whose case had already become a reference point in discussions about online sexual extortion years before the extradition took place. In October 2022, after a full trial, the British Columbia Supreme Court convicted Coban on multiple counts, including extortion and child exploitation-related offenses connected to Amanda Todd and other victims. The court imposed a 13-year prison sentence, reflecting the duration of the offending, the number of victims, and the severity of the psychological harm documented in evidence. This sentence represented the Canadian court's complete assessment of culpability. However, the legal process did not end there. Because Coban is a Dutch national, his extradition from the Netherlands came with binding conditions. Under Dutch law, sentences imposed abroad must be reviewed and converted to align with domestic sentencing standards once enforcement transfers back to the Netherlands. In December 2023, a Dutch court reviewed the Canadian judgment and commuted the 13-year Canadian sentence to 6 years. This conversion did not overturn the conviction and did not dispute the findings of the Canadian court. It was a procedural adjustment required by jurisdictional limits. In January 2025, the Dutch Supreme Court upheld the 6-year term, making it final. Coban had already been serving a separate 11-year sentence in the Netherlands for other online sexual extortion victims. When that sentence concluded, he began serving the additional 6-year term related specifically to the Amanda Todd case on September 10, 2024. As of 2026, he remains incarcerated in the Netherlands under that sentence. From this endpoint of accountability, the story moves backward to understand how the harm developed. Amanda Todd was born on November 29, 1996, and grew up in British Columbia. Like many adolescents, she spent time online, often believing she was communicating with peers. During early adolescence, she was contacted by an individual who misrepresented himself. Over time, he persuaded her to briefly expose herself on a webcam. Without her consent or knowledge, an image was captured. That single capture changed the nature of the interaction. The image became leverage. It was used to threaten exposure to classmates and others unless demands were met. Investigators later identified this as a classic example of online sexual extortion. The crime does not rely on physical presence. Its force comes from fear, anticipation, and the uncertainty of when threats will be carried out. Amanda attempted to escape the pressure by changing schools and relocating. These actions are often advised to victims, but in digital crimes, they can be ineffective. The harassment followed her online. New surroundings did not eliminate the threat because the image still existed. Each attempt to move forward risked reopening the pressure. Investigators emphasized this persistence as central to the case. The conduct was not isolated. It was repeated and intentional. In September 2012, Amanda posted a short video to YouTube. She did not speak aloud. Instead, she held handwritten cards describing what had been happening to her and how it had affected her life. The video was quiet and restrained. It did not accuse by name or dramatize events. It documented a pattern of bullying, blackmail, and isolation. Weeks later, on October 10, 2012, Amanda died at the age of 15. Canadian authorities ruled her death a suicide. After Amanda's death, Canadian police continued working with international partners. Digital crimes often cross borders, and evidence must meet legal standards in multiple jurisdictions. Years passed before a suspect was formally identified. When Dutch authorities arrested Coban in 2018, investigators connected him to dozens of victims worldwide. The same method appeared again and again: deceptive contact, image capture, and repeated threats sustained over time. The Canadian trial reinforced that pattern. Prosecutors presented communication logs showing how threats resurfaced whenever victims attempted to regain control. Metadata demonstrated when images were captured and shared. Testimony established the emotional impact of repeated exposure threats. The jury's verdict confirmed that such conduct meets the legal definition of extortion, even without physical contact. From deceit to blackmail and being extradited to face sentence, we moved to the 11th case. James Woods was 17 years old and a high school senior in Ohio when he became the target of an online financial sextortion scam in late 2022. According to investigative reporting and family statements, the entire ordeal unfolded rapidly, lasting approximately 19 to 20 hours from first contact to irreversible harm. That compressed timeline is not a footnote, it is the lesson. Understanding how those hours were engineered to overwhelm explains why early recognition and interruption are the most effective forms of prevention. The initial contact did not announce a crime. It created urgency. Someone online obtained private material and used it as leverage, demanding money and threatening to distribute the content if payment was not made. The language was direct and time-bound. Exposure was framed as imminent. Each message reset the clock. This is the first mechanism of sextortion: time compression. By insisting that consequences will occur immediately, extortionists eliminate reflection and push victims toward snap decisions. As the hours progressed, the messages multiplied. They appeared across platforms. The demand stayed the same. What changed was the victim's perception of choice. The threats were designed to feel final, even though they were not. Experts warn that paying extortionists rarely ends the abuse. It often signals vulnerability and invites further demands. But under sustained pressure, that knowledge is inaccessible. Fear crowds out context. The second mechanism is isolation. Sextortion depends on secrecy. Victims are led to believe that disclosure will bring humiliation, punishment, or permanent damage. Family statements later emphasized that James did not reach out during the ordeal because he believed exposure would be worse. This belief is not unusual. It is the intended outcome of coercion. Isolation is reinforced by repetition. Each message repeats the same claim: you are alone with this, and you must act now. Over time, even a short time, perception distorts. The future shrinks to the next hour. School, family, and long-term plans fade beneath the immediate threat. Investigators reviewing youth sextortion cases repeatedly identify this narrowing of perspective as the most dangerous phase, because it removes alternatives before victims can test them. Only after understanding pressure, isolation, and distortion does the outcome become comprehensible. James died later that same day. His death was not preceded by months of grooming or prolonged manipulation. It followed less than a day of sustained extortion pressure. That speed is why his case is now cited in education and prevention efforts. It demonstrates that online blackmail does not require time to become lethal. It requires access, urgency, and silence. After his death, James's parents spoke publicly about what happened and later founded the Do It for James Foundation, an organization dedicated to educating families, schools, and teens about sextortion and online blackmail. Everything happened quickly in a time frame under 24 hours. Finally, let's get to the last case. Daniel Perry was a 17-year-old apprentice mechanic from Dunfermline. His case is widely referenced in digital safety education because it demonstrates how online blackmail operates through pressure, isolation, and fear rather than physical force. The purpose of this content is not to sensationalize his death, but to explain clearly and accurately how the crime unfolded, how similar cases repeat the same pattern, and why early intervention changes outcomes. Daniel used the internet in ways that were common for teenagers at the time. In 2013, individuals posing as someone else contacted him online and gained his trust. After private webcam interactions, the offenders revealed that they had secretly recorded the material. What followed was a familiar sequence recognized by police in later investigations: a threat to release private images, demands for compliance, and repeated messages designed to create urgency. The threat was not framed as distant or hypothetical. It was presented as immediate and final. Reporting from major outlets in the UK and Ireland confirmed that Daniel received ongoing messages warning that the material would be shared with people he knew. This is a core feature of sextortion. The harm is not only the threat itself, but the belief that disclosure will lead to humiliation, rejection, or permanent damage to one's future. For young people, that belief can feel absolute. According to verified reporting, Daniel did not disclose the threats to his family or to authorities. The pressure remained contained and unresolved. In July 2013, Daniel died. Police treated his death as linked to online blackmail and opened an investigation into the messages he had received. Coverage by The Guardian, ITV News, RTE News, and the Irish Times established that Daniel was a victim of a cyber-enabled crime, not a perpetrator of violence. This distinction is essential because misinformation online has at times confused his case with an unrelated U.S. murder case involving a different person who shares the same name. After Daniel's death, Police Scotland issued public warnings explaining that online blackmail often involves organized groups operating across borders. Subsequent investigations linked similar threats to criminal networks overseas, including activity traced to Southeast Asia. These findings mattered because they showed that Daniel's experience was not an isolated incident. The same language, tactics, and demands appeared again and again in later cases involving different victims. Thanks for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel.